Welcome. I hope you're well. I I would like you to take a look at the following.
Another issue we haven't touched about Andrew Tate on this show, and I know everybody now will have heard of who he is. Up until a few weeks ago, he was a sensation on social media for young people and young males in particular. You've written about this in the Telegraph recently. We will not go into the court case that's going on in Romania and the very serious allegations that are made against him. But he does actually make some important points that young males are encouraged not to behave in the way that young males always have done.
I think that's the problem, because 95% of what Andrew Tate says is, I think, brash, deeply misogynistic. You know, he uses words like hoe, you know, he just spews these words out like confetti. But I think there is 5% of what he says that may be onto something. And I think the tragedy is, and the reason that people like Tate, these kind of sort of douchebaggy type men who are making a career out of being brash and rude and unpleasant and not projecting the right kind of values to young men, in my opinion, is because there are many things that we're not even vaguely allowed to talk about now. I mean, even the issue of whether there are biological sex differences between men and women, if that is taboo, then how are we to have a conversation about what role young men can have in society? And I think that there's this real gulf in discussion. And of course, when there's the gulf, opportunists and grifters and charlatans will come in to fill it.
You know, young white males are now one of the groups in society that are doing least well.
Yeah.
So there is a real issue here.
There is a real issue here. And if we're often told that feminism is about gender equality, I think if that is truly the case, then feminists need to have a bit more to say about this stuff, because quite frankly, anyone even mentioning these issues is often liable to be dismissed as a sort of, a misogynist or a sort of men's rights activist or something.
But the fact that Tate got such a big following, despite the fact, amongst the good stuff that he did say, there was some pretty offensive stuff.
Yeah, I'd say the lion's share of what he said was pretty bad.
So why did he build up such a big following?
Well, I mean, this is the problem. I think there's clearly a crisis in masculinity and a crisis in how young men view themselves and society views them. And I think that, I also think just not everyone who followed him will have necessarily agreed with everything. I mean, I think there was a certain amount of irreverent humour.
And shock value.
You know, he'll say things like, people ask me, why do you have a green Bugatti? I said to them, where's your Bugatti? You know, some of this stuff is kind of irreverent. It doesn't necessarily mean that you follow him as a kind of prophet or idol if you happen to follow him.
Okay, but a lot did.
But a lot did, and also a lot of people paid $50 a month to access his weird self-help scheme.
Now, in the past, I have talked about several changes that we are starting to notice in intersexual dynamics, the relationships between men and women, and society, families, etc. This video and what you just saw is a classical example of how hard it is to be a man today, especially in the modern West. But let me start with the following references. Perhaps this might be useful to people who may not understand the currency being used in the interaction. If you go back to the days of the suffragettes, there was a need for women's voices to be heard. There was a need for equality. At the time, there wasn't equality. A few women got together and wanted to make a change. Unfortunately, if you want change, especially change which require men to change, you cannot just ask. As the saying goes, the kingdom of God suffereth violence, and the violent shall take it by force. So, having tried peacefully for a number of years and discovering that peace doesn't always work. All is fair in love and war, and the victor always gets the spoils. And if you're not willing to apply some level of being disagreeable, nothing is handed to you on a platter. Two strategies were implemented: anger and violence. Of late, we have seen movements, groups such as Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and a few of the other organizations that have implemented a similar strategy. In the early days of the suffragettes, having applied a combination of anger and violence, they were branded similar to domestic terrorists. And they very quickly understood that their cause could not be achieved with violence. Anger was acceptable, but violence was not. So they changed strategy. They applied a different approach. They said, well, the key to our success will be to get into the heart of men. And we can change the hearts of men by appealing to things that they hold close and dear. We can use the mothers, the women they love, or the wives, the women they also love, as a pathway to influencing how men think. They came up with something which at the time was not described in this way, but in hindsight, they came up with a language called the sign language. I call it a sign language. Anger, shame, insult, guilt, the need to be right. That could be applied by any woman. In her interactions with men, the first thing you see is anger. Anger sometimes turned inwards. You would hear shame, shaming language, shaming tactics. You would hear insults, sometimes camouflaged in several sentences. She will guilt you, and she will never give up the argument if and when she is wrong. There's always that need to be right. That strategy was applied and was useful in achieving a lot of their aims. It couldn't be applied by every woman, but it could be applied by most women. Now, there were a few other strategies that were necessary, especially for women who had partners and loved ones. What was between her legs was a tool to be used. So, sex was used, sign language, externally, in public, and within the family, sex was used as a tool. If you don't agree with me, you get no sex. Men, generally speaking, have always desired the affirmation, the praise, the recognition, the presence of women. There's something about a woman's presence that brings peace, joy, serenity. And so most men will journey across the world and back to please a woman. Since the suffragettes movement and the achievement of what the feminists believe, which is equality, we have seen the sign language continue. Now, the reason I started with the video clip is as follows. Firstly, let's put aside the individual in question. Despite, from my position, my observation, perhaps in the last month, that there is a derangement syndrome that really exists regarding this said individual. But let's put him aside. And what I observed was a number of things. One, the double standard, the cognitive dissonance, the name calling, the use of sign language, the attack on masculinity, something that I have talked about several times. The praise of womanhood, feminist, womanist as being the right way. The introduction of misogyny without recognizing or realizing that they are at the same time applying misandry. in their dialogue. Shame, insult, guilt, the need to be right. And where necessary, you see what I call the palette of anger in that interaction. Let me speak to a few things. Firstly, I came to understand or know the individual that was discussed about a month ago. A friend of mine sent me a link, and I have always thought of myself as someone who can be fair in my critiques and in my analysis. I have had the opportunity to meet people, to listen to people, to study under great people, to have my failures and my successes. And it's fairly normal for me to listen to someone speak and in a short period understand, perhaps sometimes seconds, understand whether their intention is good and whether their heart is pure and whether their desire is praiseworthy. I can say that of so many people. The one thing I can also say about the said individual Tate is the few times I have heard him speak and talk about matters, he reminds me of an avatar of a person who is misunderstood. Not misunderstood simply because of his words, but misunderstood because he's an archetype of everything that is hated by women. Is he without his sins? Of course not. But he who has no sin, I would hope that they would be the first to cast the stone. The question is not about positive and negative. The question is, what is the net benefit? What is the net benefit? Is there a net positive from a person or a net negative? And my position is, in the few times that I have seen conversations that he has been part of, I have been drawn to something that I think is necessary amongst men these days, especially modern men, which is a call to adventure, a voice in the wilderness, calling out to your lost soul, especially for young men. Tate is a young man, certainly, much younger than myself, and therefore, what I see is a cascading of that name calling, a calling to adventure. His intention for younger men is pure, and he's simply saying there is potential within you. And just like you make fire, it may not come easy. And just like you find diamonds, it will not come easy. But don't worry about the heat. Just get on and bring yourself into the world. Give yourself to the world and reap whatever rewards are yours. There's also something he does very, very boldly, which is to say, the world doesn't owe you understanding. The world does not owe you forgiveness. The world does not owe you a listening ear. Your pathway as a man is supposed to be hard. It is supposed to be difficult. The responsibility is always on us as men. And therefore, in his message to young men, which I think is his targeted audience, he says, pick up your cross and without complaining and without explaining, walk up your hill to the place of skulls. That is your charge as a man. That is what I have always said in most of my teachings to men, that the world doesn't owe you understanding. And the motto of you as a man, and you should have as a man, is never complain and never explain. There's a second motto. Never try to explain your struggles as a man to a woman. and never try to get her understanding. We are built differently. Our shoulders are built for the stress that the universe, God, gives to us. We bear such burdens, recognizing carefully that if the yoke we are carrying is too heavy, then it's not for us. The yoke that we are given is there to build us rather than to break us. And I would say that more harm is done by women, and more harm has been done by the womanist feminist movement as a result of the demonization of masculinity, of the burden of performance which most men expect of each other, of the expectation for us to be all in our feelings, what I call reverse narcissism. And let me speak to this very briefly. When you listen to women like this speak, or modern women, there is an expectation that the whole of Western men, in the majority, are narcissists. Now, we hear of narcissism too often. There is this expectation that there are too many narcissists. In the West, less than 2% of all men fall within the clinical diagnosis of narcissist. Less than 2%. So much ado about nothing. However, what we do not talk about is what I call the meism, which is exhibited mainly by women, which we have started to see in young boys. Meism is reverse or inverse narcissism for women. We've been raised, especially women, to believe that our feelings is the most important thing. Now, this has come as a result of mothers asking their daughters, how do you feel? Asking their sons, how do you feel? A child goes to school, gets into an altercation, comes back home. The mother says, and how did that make you feel? Now, recognize that there are no fathers in the house. A father's approach is usually very different. We start with certain questions. What was the reason for the altercation? Who started it? How did it end? And did you also render as much damage to the person as they did to you? In other words, was it an equal exchange? Mothers, on the other hand, think that feelings are important. And so we have raised a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations that have come to believe in feelings and that their feelings is primacy. Meism, my truth, my feelings, my experience, my introduction, my definition, my journey is the ultimate God. Now, the result of this is that we have bred almost 35% and more of women fall in this category. Most women have been raised to be almost narcissistic in their outwardly expectation of the world. Most young boys have been raised in single parent families or with no fathers or with fathers who do not have a frame and are feminine in their disposition, feminized from a very early age, and therefore, even as adult males, do not hold a masculine frame. You can see that in Harry Windsor, a very, very weak frame of a man, and all he talks about is feelings. Everyone is wrong, everyone is attacking him, and he's the innocent one. Never committed any wrong in his life, just the whole bad world against him. Men, on the other hand, we do not have, should I use the word, the privilege to rest in our feelings. We act and we do. And when we get results, we only use feelings as a signal, as a messenger to say, perhaps there's something that needs to be carefully looked into. Feelings for men is only necessary in understanding the difference between what was actually proposed to take place and your actual results. In other words, action is the name of the game. Activity is the name of the game. If I have a goal and I strive for that goal and I fall short of the goal, at the moment of coming to introspect about my reason for failure, a feeling will come. That feeling will be a negative feeling if I failed, or a positive feeling if I succeeded. It's a messenger. It brings a message to you that says you've succeeded or you failed. We take the message, we shut the door, and we read the message. We get on with life. Now, the reason I have explained all of this is to say, whenever women who have been raised in this same ideology come across men who do not give time, energy, power to feelings, there's an expectation that these men are broken, that these men are beyond repair, and these men should not be an inspiration to young men, and young men should not aspire to be like these men. There is a reason for this. When you civilize your world, so much so that threats, war, hunger, and all of the things that plagued us once are no longer within reach, then we move up what Maslow describes as the hierarchy of needs. Shelter, food, clothing is the physiological, basic level. We can then move to the next level of goal setting and self-actualization and self-esteem. In developing countries, you do not see this madness. In the modern West, you see all of this madness, so much so that those who hold and stand guard over what has kept this civilization intact are vilified. They're called names. Ukraine was a useful example. All of the men were expected to stay, fight, and die for their country. The women were free to leave with the kids. We don't get to choose our path as men. It's a hard path. We shoulder the burdens of manhood without apology and without the need for a woman's approval. Because without such strict expectations on men, the world falls apart, it falls into pieces. Now let me conclude by saying the following. Young men, never complain, never explain. Choose who you want to follow. If Tate is the person you think is right for you, it means there is something, there's a calling you have in your heart when you hear his voice, when you hear his message, and when you reach out to him. You are on your own path. You will learn, you will make mistakes, you will grow. Pain plus reflection is what creates progress and development. You are going to try so many different recipes. You will never hold on to only one doctrine. You will try different things. But that is part of the journey of manhood. You're trying to understand and define the essence of you. Women don't understand that the burden of performance required of men is so high. Only women can be youthful and have beauty and have chastity, or even not, and go through life doing nothing but just trading off their physical attributes and still have another man step forward and say, I'm happy to journey with you through life. I will provide for you. As men, the burden of performance is very, very, very different. Our value is not something that is given to us at birth or at a young age. We are given potential. We have to take that potential, get out of our mother's basements, just like the story of Abraham, the story of Moses, and I can keep going on. At some point, sometimes late, we hear the voice calling out to us to say, the time is near and the time has come. And we start our journey. We forge a path that perhaps is not straight. We squiggle on our way to success, on our way to manhood. Along that journey, you will have people on the sides of the street and the road, calling you names, making inferences of your choices. The best advice I can give you, just stay focused. Stay focused on the dream you have. Stay focused on the goal you have. And someday you will get there. Someday you will find that your dreams, your goals will be within reach. You may not know how you get there, but I have found from my experience that success leaves clues. And one of the best ways to attain success, however you define success, is to find models, mentors, coaches, inspirations, and replicate their success. By combining your experiences with their experiences, you can live vicariously through their lived experiences and therefore minimize pain and sorrow and wasted time. Inasmuch as you have a craving for the admiration of a woman, for the affirmation of a woman, for the encouragement, recognition, and acceptance of a woman, understand your path is a different path. You need to be with the pack. You need the boys. You need the group. You need to keep your eyes on the prize. And don't be swayed by criticisms like you heard from this young lady. And this is perhaps a useful statement to make. Feminism and womanism comes in different colors. The same evil, vile statements are consistent. One might look at a woman and say, well, she doesn't look like a feminist. Well, most feminists do not look like feminists until they speak. The hatred for masculinity is so strong. And I'll close with the following statement. In the West, we have disintegrated a family unit. We've done so through the state. Now, I should say, the family unit is the first foundation block of every nation. Not the state, the family. The family precedes the state. Two individuals come together as the foundation block to form a family. The family was created before the state. As a matter of fact, the state is a product of the family. But we have inverted the hierarchy of responsibility such that the state dictates what the family does, and what we've seen through laws, regulations, and largely poor elected officials making rules on our behalf. We've seen the disintegration of the family unit, so much so that there are no good men in families. So, and to the young woman who was on the video, most young boys grow up without a father, without structure, a vision, an identity, without the importance of delayed gratification. They grow up without someone to rough and tumble play with or roughhouse, without understanding how to take risks and how to navigate the world. But there is a voice in their head which they can hear. The voice is a call to adventure. And whenever that voice is listened to carefully, that voice manifests itself in the form of another man. It may be a man that society disagrees with. It might be a man that perhaps people do not like. Jordan Peterson was the last one, from what I could understand. Tate perhaps is the next one. It doesn't matter what that vessel looks like. It doesn't matter how broken that vessel might be. Young boys are looking for father. And it doesn't matter how much we criticize the avatar that is put before us as the voice. That need and that longing for father will continue. Young girls, on the other hand, unfortunately, have been raised to loathe fathers and men and the masculine presence. For some reason, the anger, the shame, the frustration of a mother is transferred to their daughters. So much so that everything that is masculine, everything that is beautiful, everything that one should be proud of is seen as toxic. Now, I don't believe there is any such thing as toxic masculinity. That was just a word created by women, shared with weak men, and then propagated through the largely feminine, largely female media and liberal institutions, so much so that men these days have a crisis of masculinity. I would say to you, if you are a man, choose you this day who you will follow. It might be the wrong person at the right time. If a pivot is needed, you will come to your road to Damascus moment, and you will realize that the things you once loved, you suddenly hate, and the things you used to hate, perhaps you now love. Your name will be changed from Saul to Paul. Everyone has their journey and their life to lead. Choose whatever you choose as a young man. Be open, be adventurous. Don't hold on to one particular ideology or frame, and allow yourself to be influenced by other men. But remember, your true north is the top of the hill. Pick up your cross. Find other groups of men that have their crosses on their backs. Don't complain, don't explain. I hope that's been useful.